Welcome to Law Scribe Media, presented by Bosky Beards. We're here today with Brent Schlueter. You may recognize him from many other shows. He's a geopolitical analyst and a revisionist historian. We've had a great dynamic, possibly because it's a Gemini-Sagittarius opposing kind of synergy. But I'm very happy to have him here in the studio with us today, and welcome.
Yeah, it's been a good. Once again, after our last podcast was after that parade with all the feminists. Now all of a sudden, now we have where everyone goes full retard about the flag, and there's debates on both sides, and you can buy both arguments because the idolization of the flag is a bit of a cloth idolatry, and yes, it might be a symbol of nationalism for some people, but certain people it might not be. And yes, the Star Spangled Banner, if you actually listen to the lyrics, is much like Old Testament ideology. Oh, our flag was still there because God was with us type mentality. Well, yeah, I can understand why people would kneel, but to me, it's a matter of respecting the house that you're in, even if you disagree with it. Because when you do that, you are able to make a point. And the problem I see is it's like a jingoistic argument over standing and kneeling for a cloth, and it's not about anything relevant to what would make the situation better. If it's about police killing blacks in inner cities and things like that, well, one of the things they could do that is the ADL influence over cops and cops going to Israel and learning anti-terrorist techniques. I don't see anything relevant. It's much like Charlottesville. It's like we're not addressing relevant issues. We're just debating this versus this, and this idiotic rounded up people versus this idiotic rounded up people. And it doesn't, and maybe a few of them have a point, but this is not how you do it. And it's much like Malcolm X talked about, having your sit-down philosophy. It's like we need to have a stand-up philosophy, and that's what we're not doing. Is we don't have that stand-up philosophy. It's sit down. We always try to find the easiest way out to protest, and that makes us feel good, and it becomes a bit of an activist masturbation, where it feels good, but it doesn't really do anything. And I think that that's what this is all about. It's really just two sides masturbating, essentially, not getting anything done. And then, of course, Trump has to play to this manifest destiny soccer hooligan base that he has appealed to, because that's what got him elected. I mean, yes, we Trump supporters, in a political sense, can say that, yeah, this, and this righteously, but let's be really honest. What won him the election was this populist soccer hooligan pep rally mentality that was able to have a landslide effect over Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, he was a cheerleader for Americana, essentially.
Right. And basically using the manure of manifest destiny and growing the crop of things that he could actually accomplish that would actually do something that would help us, like containing Israel. Mm-hmm. But in order for him to do that, he has to win the election and win the populace. And so he's kind of got to do a bait and switch. I called it righteous nationalism. That's what he's essentially appealed to. And if he uses his alchemy to turn that into anti-Semitism gold, then we have to back that, even if a lot of it looks really bad. And that's why, like a lot of with the North Korea and Iran and all these other countries, like him talking about Assad, well, it essentially amounts to a pro wrestling promo by a heel. That's essentially what this is. He's playing. He's got to play up the bad guy. Trump embraces the bad guy role. He knows that. He knows he's a billionaire. He knows there's a certain amount of people that hate him. And the people that
embraces being a villain.
Yeah, he gets off on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is like the ultimate symbol of 80s hedonistic yuppiedom. And He's okay with that. He's willing to play it up. And eventually a lot of people respect that, because a lot of people have a manifest destiny mentality in the United States, and they glorify the asshole type person. Because
we're probably the one country in the world that really embraces that asshole, rugged individualism. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make your own way, and then don't listen to anybody.
And it's a byproduct of a Protestant shaped culture. Because you look at all the Protestant shaped cultures, the three dominant Protestant shaped cultures have that mentality. Great Britain, Germany, and the United States. They have that supremacist mentality. And, okay, for us, it's not Nile to Euphrates, it's Atlantic to Pacific. And for Great Britain, for 200 years, it was ocean to ocean, every ocean to every ocean. So there you have that mimicking of the Judaic mentality. Well, a lot of that has to do with Protestant culture. Well, where did Protestant culture come from? A lot of it came from Germany embracing the Kabbalah before any other European nation. And if you look at Kabbalah concepts and you look at Protestant concepts, they're very, very similar, especially like election. Well, election is rooted in spiritual abundance, the Kabbalist concept. So when you put these two together, and then like Machiavellianism and social Darwinism, the essence of your Protestant cultures, it becomes so easy for that to be a vehicle for imperialism. But who are they really doing the imperialism for? This international money lender that is standing behind, controlling the kings and the queens and the presidents and the Congress. So the Trojan wasp, which I call it, becomes a front for all of that, a buffer for all of that. And whenever you have an exceptionalist mentality, the Jews look at that like, oh, a handle just came out of your head. Now I can just control you and pull you around by that. So, Arab supremacy is like that. But through Arab supremacy, we've created Wahhabism, or we've been able to create anti-Shiaism, and we've been able to create all kinds of supremacy by them. And a lot of it is what made Germany so easy to control, was that, oh, okay, supremacists, you have a handle by your head, we're going to control you with it. You look at India with the Hindutva mentality. It's very similar to Judaism, because you have a greater India. And they have the same mechanisms and the same attitude as the Jews do.
India and China both have a diaspora population that maintain jingoistic nationalism in the diaspora. I've met Indians here, I've met Chinese people here, and unlike Americans who feel like they need to apologize everywhere they go around the world, Indians are very... Most of them, I wouldn't say all, of course, because it's 1 billion people, just like China. But you'll see a lot of nationalism, despite being here and everything else. Like, well, we do it just so much better back home. And, Chinese, I've noticed that as well. And so it's like they're projecting their culture and their, nation into other nations. So I'm not saying that they're as a corrosive force like the Jewish diaspora, because they've obviously had practice for thousands of years. But it's not entirely dissimilar.
The difference between them is the Jews have been smart enough to control the moneylender aspect and the usury base.
Right.
You can control all the central banks. You control all the leaders in the world, and then you can manipulate wars.
Yeah, Indians and Chinese seem to be limited to nepotism. So when you see one Indian CEO, and all of a sudden you see an influx of Indians in those corporations and in high positions, and same thing with Chinese when they're here, and they do work together, which I think, on a very basic level, should be commended. I feel like as Muslims, we lament the fact that the Ummah, the larger Muslim population of the world, is so disunited, and our de facto leadership becomes Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE and all these groups, or if not that, then umbrella groups that are associated with them through the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, like CARE and ISNA, and now the MJAC, which is the Muslim Jewish, I think, Advisory Council or something, which is just a amalgamation of an opportunity to have like Goyim discontent. And it's very dangerous in my opinion, but we'll get to that. Let me get back to the national anthem issue. I feel like, first of all, Trump, you have to look at the spectacle of why he may have done it. I think Alabama, being a southern state, the fact that he was there, he knew those little buttons to push with them. Because this sentiment, I think, is quite common in the South, the idea that we have some type of national unity, and if you disrespect the nation, then what are you really even doing here? Minorities don't seem to understand that because through cultural Marxism in the academic environment, they've been taught that, love of a nation is borderline racism. It's hatred of others. It's something that, belongs in the past, because now we're shifting and ushering in a globalist era where, all nations have to come together as one. Individual national sovereignty disappears. And so because of that and because of the prolonged brainwashing, those individuals have a knee-jerk antagonistic response to nationalism. And so I think what he was trying to do is, if you look at it from, his perspective or the perspective of even, let's say, a white supremacist in the South, which is, I think, largely a made-up concept. I'm not saying they don't exist, but it's not like they have critical mass or any kind of unity or any kind of ability to affect massive change. You consider the spectacle of what it was. He said that to rile up the quote-unquote base. In that same speech, he also seemed to endorse Luther Strange for Senate, I believe it was, despite the fact that Bannon came out in heavy support of Roy Moore. And I think, Trump did that to show Mitch McConnell that, hey, I'm trying, I'm trying to help you guys out, because Mitch McConnell obviously really wanted Luther Strange. And Mitch McConnell is the embodiment of American incompetence, I would say. And we know that because my folks live in Kentucky, and so I know Kentuckians who thoroughly despise him.
His wife seems competent. He just doesn't seem competent.
Right. And he should be grateful that his wife was put in the position that she was by Trump as well, which he clearly isn't. But anyway, and then Trump in the middle of his speech, when he doesn't recognize his mistakes ever. He said, well, maybe I made a mistake. And I think it was kind of a wink nod kind of type of thing, like, hey, I can't really come out and say what I need to say, but read between the lines, because you guys are intelligent enough to do that. So what the Jews have done through the Soros-side organizations and cultural Marxism and stuff like that, identity politics, is that they've riled up minorities to be antagonistic to Trump, to the flag, to national unity, to white folks, etc. And it was about time for there to be a backlash anyway. And so because this is a sticking point, and because he has a bully pulpit in a sense at the presidency, he knows that this can drive a wedge. Not only that, but everybody understands dollars and cents, especially NFL owners and sports teams owners. And he knows that if he can kick them where it hurts, he can nip a lot of this stuff in the bud, because NFL players are not giving up their massive salaries, and their salaries will dip heavily if the largely white fan base stops supporting the teams. And so one thing that happened as a result of Trump saying that is it created a divide where all these sports people came out against him, and these basketball players and football players and everyone else, people who are not even really supporting Kaepernick, and his knee. Within the NFL, other black players who were not supporting him came out in support of him because of the fact that Trump used the word son of a bitch, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that wouldn't be the first time that Trump has said something off the cuff that, he could have couched in better terms anyway. And so from that perspective, I would say it was, in a sense, you could say it was genius, because I think it's either one way or the other. And me personally, I, as a sports fan or someone as a spectator, I've been in, different environments where I've sat down. People rose for the national anthem and I sat down. And not because I don't appreciate being an American. I just don't like the authoritarian nature of, groupthink and, getting everyone on one hand and saying, oh, you must do this. I have a naturally rebellious attitude. And so from that perspective, I never, for the most part, never really stood up. Or if I was caught standing, I didn't put my hand on my heart because
I have a perspective on that. It's like, okay, if I have a relative who is Catholic, okay, and I'm not Catholic, and I go to, let's say, his wedding, his baptism, his whatever, I'm going to go put on a nice suit. And if the congregation is standing, I'm probably going to stand. If they're kneeling, I'm going to kneel. I'm going to do what the congregation does. And it's a matter of just respect within the house. If you have a problem with what is in that house, what we should actually do is use this freedom of speech that we're arguing about and be specific with what you are arguing about instead of kneeling and stuff. I would respect the kneeling more if people would actually talk about the relevant issues, if there were actually talk. Because obviously there's microphones being thrown in front of these people's face. They're just not talking about it. Instead, all they can do is talk jingoistically about Trump.
It's interesting because they asked, and this is very rare because nobody's even required. Like, I've had these discussions of people who are anti-Trump, and I'm like, what's wrong? What do you not like? Just everything, just what he says and what he's about. But that doesn't answer my question. Mm-hmm. What is it specifically that's bothering you so much, right? And it really, they can't, most of the time they can't quote him. Now, obviously, he's went off on, like, Mika Brzezinski, his Big News daughter, about, her plastic surgery or something. So he will go into what we would call a degrading
He's embracing his heel character as a pro wrestler. He's a pro wrestling heel. If you look at him that way, you can kind of see what he's actually doing.
Mm-hmm. And so, he'll do things that, you'll be like, well, that was not very presidential. That was not very clean cut. That was, beneath the office or beneath the dignity. My retort to that is that, so you were okay with Obama saying wonderful things on TV and acting so sophisticated and classy. Meanwhile, he's facilitating the rape of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children. So, and that's something you may not understand, you may not pay attention to, but it is real. And if it is real, then I would rather take a president who says what he feels and, has a aggressive stance towards his detractors rather than someone who seems so compliant and ready to bow down to anyone, and any umbrella group. I mean, there was a lot of things that Obama didn't want to do, say vis-a-vis Syria and a lot of other issues, or even things that Netanyahu wanted. But he didn't have the spine to really stand up to any of it. And not only that, but he didn't have the moral pragmatism, I would even say, to find ways around those issues. I think the only thing he can really get credit for is not starting World War III. But as you see, Trump, at least on the surface, has ended, CIA covert support for the so-called rebels, and a variety of other things that he's done on a global scale. Like even his UN speech, a lot of people didn't like it. Well, I thought the North Korea stuff was cartoonish bluster. I mean, I thought the words, the rhetoric against Iran was largely, if you want, it was mild. And the reason I say that is because he didn't say death to Iran the way Iran go into the street and say death to America. So I'm not saying that one way or the other that's incorrect or inappropriate or whatever. They have the right to do what they wish. But if you do that to if you say those things about a country, I mean, obviously that country has a right to respond. And so I think a lot of times in our movement, we just kind of take our own personal biases and color our perception with those. But at the end of the day, anything he said about Iran, I mean, obviously they're not a sponsor of terror and all of that. I wouldn't agree with that notion. Now, Hamas does use terror tactics. You can't deny that, as it relates to Israel. And, you can argue that they're forced into that circumstance. And obviously, Iran does support Hamas, and they're actually trying to have a reconciliation with Syria as well, with Bashar al-Assad, because I think Hamas is almost like a bratty child. And it's, very, it hasn't appreciated the kind of support that it has received from Iran, from Syria, from Hezbollah. And they've largely still aligned themselves with the Wahhabist Sunni empires.
It's that Muslim Brotherhood connective tissue.
Right. And so, but again, back to the the anthem issue. I think that when they asked Steph Curry, the reason I brought that up was they asked Steph Curry, what do you not agree with? Well, he's like, everything, like what he says and what he's about, and like it's always nebulous. It's always never specific. So when you sit there and you put these athletes on a podium to have them discuss, or even LeBron, right? I mean, LeBron is like making jokes about this stuff, but at the end of the day, I think it was a smart move, because it's like you're either with us or you're against us. This is nationalism. This is what we're trying to resurrect on a global scale. And if you look at his UN speech, it lines up with that, in the sense that in the UN speech he's saying every nation should support its citizens and focus on its the betterment of and ameliorating conditions within the nation, and as a nation, be focused on what you need for your nation. And he said that there was no problem with that, which is interesting, because a few years ago, our Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya community, he came to Capitol Hill, and he said the same thing. To a bipartisan group of senators and congressmen, he said the same thing. That every nation has rights, and every nation should try to get what it needs for its people, but not encroach on other nations' rights as well. And it seemed like
here's the other thing about that is none of this imperialism of the United States has benefited the United States.
Exactly.
So to say we're doing this for selfish reasons, no, we're doing it because of the Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby. That's what we fought. That's why we went to Iraq. That's why you can't make an argument that in the past 200 years, the United States has been in a war that has actually benefited them. So to say imperialism has benefited the United States, no, it hasn't. So to say that imperialism was done in the sense of American nationalism, that's an oxymoron, because it has hurt American nationalism.
Tangibly. And what's interesting is the whole Soros affiliated groups, what their whole goal is to create disunity and then blame the other side. It's like when during the election campaign, Clinton was talking about Trump, or at least Clinton's connected apparatus was talking about how Trump was either a child molester or a pedophile and all of that. That's because they were covering up what they were doing, and they knew that eventually that information would come out. I'm sure they knew about the breaches, and at that point they are like, okay, well, people are going to accuse us of this, let's preempt that by accusing him of this. So when he accuses us of this, if he does, or if his supporters do, people are like, what are you talking about? We got video of Trump saying that he would date his daughter, and what a creep and stuff like that. And that, okay, like, that might be a comment that a Gemini made versus, a global child trafficking ring that the Clinton Foundation is an integral part of. I mean, if you just look at what happened with Haiti and Laura Silsby, and they got caught for once or twice. I mean, they had dozens and dozens of children. And a lot of times what the Jews have been very successful at, like Black Lives Matter, right? It's a very potent example and poignant example of how they use words to hide what they're actually doing. So, for example, a lot of the groups and the organizations that exploit children are organizations that are explicitly to stop the exploitation of children. So, why do you have 30 kids with you boarding a plane? Well, we're here to protect the children. Oh, really? And that's what they've done. Even Freemasonry, what is it? Liberty, equality, fraternity, I think it was. I mean, why would you be against that? Why would you be against, a fraternity or brotherhood amongst people that disregards religion and, is there for equality and liberty? I mean, but again, this is how they do things. And this is why when people say Black Lives Matter, it's like, how could you be against Black Lives Matter? What are you saying? Black lives don't matter? No, Black Lives Matter is just it's like if you put, something on your forehead. I mean, that doesn't necessarily define you. It's just a sticker, and they're using that to encroach on certain things that we've held sacred. Like, for example, I mean, you can't argue that the police haven't had lots of issues and murdering innocent people. But again, it's not just black people. Just a few weeks ago, they shot an unarmed white man, and they've done that. They've shot unarmed white kids. And not to say that there isn't some racist element, but there's also crime within minority communities. So that has to play a role. And also, if you look at the training that these police undergo that you've already alluded to, and also the kind of low quality individuals that, are attracted to being policemen, and you consider the fact that they may have been bullied as children and then they become these steroided out,
But see, if
crazies.
if Kaepernick or anybody would talk like this about it, I would respect their knee. That's the problem. There's not a lot of talk about this. It's just, oh, well, cops are shooting black people. Let's take a knee and
and there's no association. There's no association with the flag and police anyway.
Right.
And then here's the other problem with that is that he didn't say, I'm taking this knee because this flag has represented oppression to the people, let's say people of color all around the world, because that would be true, in many ways, whether you look at Iraq or whether you look at Afghanistan or you look at Palestine, based on what Israel is doing with the United States sponsorship.
Could totally get behind him for that.
Of course, nobody. I don't think anyone. But he didn't. He didn't internationalize his perspective, and he didn't make a solid case. And I think the reason why is because he's thoroughly uneducated, just like many people who bloviate, and then they're given a platform. Well, that's like saying, well, if I become a billionaire tomorrow, all of a sudden, I'm going to be spreading anti-Semitism all around the world. But at least on my, from my perspective, I am educated on those subjects, so I can discuss them in detail. Whereas if you just give a platform to someone who really doesn't know what they're talking about, it's going to be revealed. And then, you obviously have less respect for that individual. So I think by Trump doing this, and we can probably end the subject here, he's creating like a strong, he's like they've already created that line in the sand, and he's just defining it even more. He's like, okay, you made that line in the sand. Well, let me just define this even more. You see this big line? This is where we draw the line. And, they say he's quote unquote race baiting. And, they always say that, people use certain types of language as a dog whistle, I think they say, to like represent racism and stuff like that. And I don't disagree that some element of that didn't play a role in him being in Alabama and saying that, these bratty children who are sportsmen in our nation are thoroughly ungrateful. Because if you look at it from our perspective, my perspective, I mean, black men in America or black athletes, let's say in America, are far more privileged than a lot of other Americans, and a lot more privileged than almost any other group all around the world. And I would even argue maybe more privileged than white people in Europe, which is fascinating to me because, with all of this modern technology, with all the elimination of racism, with all the intermixing in America that's already transpired in ethnicities and stuff like that, they have facilitated, a higher level of understanding of individuals and race and things like that. And we've come to a place where we're really far away from the old racism of the past, where it was very blatant. It was, even when I grew up in high school, there were people who said things to me like, oh, this and that about being Muslim or whatever. And I mean, it was a little irritating. I was younger. I wasn't as educated, but I certainly didn't feel like a victim. I felt like they were stupid, and I could defend my views if they were heard. And so, it's overblown that we are now in such a horrifically, racist state. And we've never been there before. And Trump has, brought out our inner demons. And, people like Popovich, who is a very good coach. And, I mean, you can make a case that he's a very good coach. And, but he's adding his voice to this. And what's going to happen is you're going to have a whole new generation of white people who are supposed to hate themselves in order to survive. And I think that is untenable beyond anything else. I mean, you can't have a generation of people hating themselves, and if you've convinced them that way with fatuous arguments and vacuous arguments, let's say, they're eventually going to probably go to the opposite extreme, because they're going to say, well, the stuff that these people have presented to us is incorrect. There's a ton of black on white violence. There's a ton of black on black violence. There's a ton of violence which leads policemen to be more trigger happy. And so all of these play a role in the current circumstance and situation. And why should we allow people who have hundreds of millions of dollars to their name, who get paid for 30-second spots in commercials just because of the accident of birth and, having superior genetics, let's say, and living in America, in a free country where, you can gain that type of salary, playing a child sport. Why should we let them bludgeon us with their ideology when they don't even have a valid claim, and they don't even have a true understanding of what's going on, and they can't defend their perspective? So I think it's going to be a backlash, and the more and more minorities that come out against this and come out for supporting national unity in the face of Judaic globalism, I think that the Jews again have overstepped their bounds, and only time will tell how much.
Well, what's unique about the NFL as opposed to other sports is basically well over 95% of the people in the NFL were born in the United States, live in the United States, are United States citizens. You look at like the San Antonio Spurs. They won 4 world titles with a backcourt of Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili. Do they play the French national anthem before the game? Do they play the Argentinian national anthem before the game? They play one national anthem before the game unless they play in Toronto. And so they've had this contribution from these people, but Tony Parker stands for the national anthem. Manu Ginobili stands for the national anthem. They got Pau Gasol now.
White privilege.
Yeah. You just respect the house that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a legitimate gripe about that. But then if you have a legitimate gripe, use your mouth. You talk about freedom of speech, we'll use that freedom of speech. Nobody's shutting you up. Believe me, CNN would love to hear what you have to say if you're this minority person, because they're going to milk off of that. Mm-hmm. Unless you say something that's not what they want to see.
Well, that well is drying up for them, and that's why if you continue to put out intellectual thought, even if it's opposing my opinion or a white nationalist opinion of America, put it out, But they don't have that. That's why they have to do symbolic things. Athletes don't have.
To be honest with you, I don't care if they play the national anthem at all.
Right. Right.
It doesn't care. But don't be phony in front of me and act like you're being this activist.
Exactly.
It's like John Wooden, the great basketball coach, said, "Don't never confuse activity for achievement." But I think that's what activists do nowadays. Is they confuse activity for achievement. Oh, I'm doing something. I'm just not accomplishing anything.
Yeah, like the Women's March.
Yeah.
That's a great example.
And, I mean, even within our movement, and the 9/11 Truth Movement. And then we sit around and argue about, did planes hit the Twin Towers? Did planes not hit? Did planes blah, 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 planes, thermite,
right, you have these cloisters of conversations.
And then a small percentage are actually talking about Israel.
Right, and then you have these cloisters of conversations, and it's in this massive abyss where it's not escaping. It's like the event horizon in a black hole. It's not escaping anyone. No one else is outside. The movement is really seeing it. You're not bringing more people in, mm-hmm. And this is where I have not necessarily respect, but I can't deny the efforts that guys like England did accomplish, such a massive feat, which was getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views on their website. Obviously they're volatile. Obviously they're quote unquote racist, or they say hateful things. And obviously there's very little intellectual depth at all whatsoever. But, with the changing times, whether it's memes or whether it's just radicalizing the way you communicate these ideas, they successfully created massive amounts of radicalized individuals who previously were probably playing video games at home. Yeah, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing overall, but the tactics that they used could be, you can achieve those without being, so horrifically, hateful or whatever, and just look at it from the perspective of, the comedy, the exaggeration, and the addressing of the Jewish issue with, as much force as you can possibly muster. Because when we talk, I remember when I first woke up and got into this, it was like 2003, 2004, and into 2005 and 6. I remember I would always be like, well, no, I don't hate all Jews. I definitely am not against Jews at all. There's all these good Jews, and I think I may have even at that time been a little confused and spoke about Naturi Karta, like, well, there's some Jews that are against Zionism, and it's really not about Zionism. Now you're looking at 11 years back in the day, but I think that the more aggressive stance makes more sense, because these people are raping children. These people are destroying the planet. They've got a million simultaneous evil plots. And so if you want to radically alter people's consciousness, you have to be a little radical, because most people are not, especially in the soundbite era, we don't have the attention span to sit through and dig through information and make sure that there's like a high level of accuracy with every factoid. In this day and age, it's more about the massive, critical mass of people that you bring onto your general ideology and having them espouse it and spread that and everything else. And in order to do that, you have to kind of piecemeal your ideology, and you have to kind of, it's like feeding steak to a baby, you know. These people are not educated, they don't read and stuff like that, so how do you reach them, you know? And that's why me and Jonathan Madcold, shout out, being persecuted by Canada, and Benai Barith, that's why we do music, because it's a simple, easy way. In hip-hop, you know, there's nobody even willing. There's a guy named Lupe Fiasco, people know him, he's mentioned the Jews a couple times, and he had to grovel at the altar of Jewish feeling whenever he said the things that he did about Jews. And the facts that he stated were true, but the problem was that he backtracked. Similar to Valerie Plame, you know, who suffered at the hands of the Jews at the CIA. She recently tweeted an article by Philip Giraldi called, I think, America's Jews are responsible for America's wars. She knew what she was doing, but because the outlash was so magnificent and monstrous, she backed off, and she said, "Oh, I made a mistake," and blah 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 blah, and don't persecute me.
Yeah,
so, but if our culture had gotten to that point where so many more people were aware of this, then, you know, we wouldn't have to apologize and grovel.
The problem, though, is if you marry with that white nationalist element, then all of a sudden you get associated with it, and then you get a filibuster effect where you have to waste time defending yourself with it. And also the fact that when you explain this to people outside of an echo chamber, outside into just a general populist and people like that, when you associate that and you associate people that are using nigger, spick, all this with Pepe the Frog, and they will be turned off by this automatically.
Yeah.
They won't even listen to you.
Right.
So when you say trying to make a difference, well, yes, maybe it took hundreds of thousands of disgruntled people and got them there, but then it limited us there because you're not going to get the mainstream by associating with the white nationalists.
Of course not. Yeah.
So
I just mean as a phenomenon of what they accomplished, I think that there are certain things you can take away from that to.
You can take away anything from any bad movement, anything. I quote Chairman Mao all the time. It's like, I don't support Chairman Mao. He just has good quotes. You know, it's like the Israeli prime ministers have good quotes. You just have to, you take from each thing. You can take from your enemy. The best way to learn about the Jews is to read the Jewish books.
Exactly.
The Jewish sources. Read Haaretz, read JPost, Ynet, Times of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
All of them. It's. I mean, and if you don't have time to do it, The Ugly Truth dumbs it down for you and puts it right there and does it every single day. Yeah,
it's a great website where they collect a lot of good information. So moving on to other geopolitical matters, Trump's UN speech. Obviously, people had a lot of issues with that. What do you think about what's happening with North Korea right now? And what do you think about also Kim Jong-un's response to Trump? And just kind of because there's two colorful characters there, and with Dennis Rodman as the go-between, which I don't think a lot of people recognize, but I think he's a de facto ambassador trying to calm
I feel
down
like they're getting ready to meet at WrestleMania. Well,
in that case, I would put my money on Trump. I mean, the other guy is a very small guy.
Yeah, you might know karate or something. But,
that's true.
I don't.
They did a parody video or some type of shock video of American F-35s and B-1B bombers or whatever being blown out of the sky. Did you see that? In the last couple of days, they just put out a propaganda video, essentially.
Of course, they're going to put out propaganda videos. That's what they do, and they're going to try to scare. This is the ultimate fear porn. And believe me, there is something to be scared of. If they actually do have a hydrogen bomb is a serious matter.
Absolutely.
It can blow up.
Which is another creation of the Jews.
Right. So, but I think that Kim Jong-un and the North Korea is basically doing, they're looking at Gaddafi over here, and they're looking at, Syria only stands because he's backed by Putin. And other leaders that, like Saddam was saying, you give up your chemical weapons and your nukes and you're going to get dragged and sodomized. He doesn't want that to happen to him. I mean, like, Seoul, South Korea is like 35 miles from the North Korean border. And within, like, that border, like a 30-mile radius, there's like 25 million people. People don't understand how crowded South Korea is. You just put guns in front of those people and they can storm the border. they could very easily take it. Now, do you honestly believe, does anyone with any common sense believe that he is going to launch any atomic bomb, missile, whatever, and risk a naval carrier that could probably within 5 to 10 minutes wipe out his country? Do you honestly think that Kim is that crazy? Does anybody think that?
I think people do think that, and the reason why is because number one, he's got a really small country, and obviously they have some weaponry, and they're working on trying to refine it, but because of his statements, which is part of international theater, they tend to believe that he would, because he may be suicidal, or he is so power hungry that push comes to shove that he would. And I'm not saying that he would. I'm just saying that the case can be made based on the media presentations and the statements of both individuals.
Well, I think that Kim realizes that the country's going to be wiped out and things could get a lot worse. Because, if sanctions hurt their country, their GDP is like $1,700 a person. Now, if you take that and it's like they're spending all this money to develop nuclear technology, why not feed your people with that? But at the same time, they realize what has happened in other countries. They don't want to become the Libya of the Far East. Mm-hmm. And they realize that could be the case. And I think that's why China, even despite ridicule, has helped them out. Because in that power vacuum, some Jewish entity, radicalized entity, will probably take over North Korea. And then if that would happen, then they're going to come down. Where's that going to go? China, Russia. They're going to be in the proximity of that area. And then that's probably a lot of the point behind trying to demonize not only that, but their alliance with Iran and Syria. So it's obvious why they're being condemned. Anybody that associates themselves with Syria is going to feel the wrath of Judaic interests because they believe the Nile to the Euphrates is theirs anyway. And you're just trespassing on that area. That's the Jewish mindset. So any support, one of the things that North Korea does is they supply Syria with technology. Now, to take nuclear power and miniaturize it, put it on a missile, and make it functional for being a nuclear warhead on top of a missile, that is a very expensive process. It's a very time-consuming process. And when you have $1,700 person GDP, doesn't seem practical unless there is a real threat that certain people are going to go in and take that country. So by him speaking out against it, on both sides speaking out against this, I think that they're diffusing the situation with the illusion of escalating the situation. Because now people are bought into the drama and nothing's really happening on either side. But they feel like something's happening on either side. It's like these manifest destiny people that, let's get North Korea, they feel like they're being appeased because Trump's talking about it. And they hate these, rednecks that hate Iran. Oh, well, they're feeling appeased. Meanwhile, Trump's not really doing anything. He's just talking. It's pro wrestling promos. And that's all he's doing is appeasing his base. And it's a lot like they always said about Ronald Reagan is he gives like the impression of this John Wayne swagger so that you don't have to go in and be a threat to in military. Well, that's what they said early in his term. Then they found out he was the same imperialist. But, it's like the image of toughness prevents you from having to fight. So he's, by projecting himself as this tough-talking pro wrestling heel, he's actually preventing war. Mm-hmm. Whereas the smooth talkers have been the ones getting us into wars, really.
Yeah, because it's a bait and switch. You show them one thing, and that's what they think they're talking about, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got to have a war. Oh, okay, let's go.
I mean, during the whole Obama administration, you have 7 wars going on,
mm-hmm.
and there's
and all anyone can think of is how polished he is as a speaker.
Yeah. Yeah, and everything he did for homosexuals.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the backlash is going to come from the fans of these sports. I don't think. I think, where was it? Dallas, in the Dallas Cowboys game.
They all knelt.
They all knelt. I don't think it was. I think it was after the national anthem. They all knelt to avoid issues, but the crowd booed. You know,
it's
and it
Texas.
was very audible.
Yeah.
And similarly, with the Steelers, they didn't come out.
Yeah,
as a
except
team.
one.
Except one. I think his name was Villanueva, so he's a part, I think, Hispanic at least.
Yeah, he's an Army veteran.
An Army veteran. And so,
West Point graduate, too.
Right. And so he from his perspective, obviously, he served in the military. I think it was in Afghanistan or whatever.
Yeah.
And because of that, he came out. And they were trying to reprimand him because, see, the thing is, they didn't engage where public sentiment is, because public sentiment is really what's going to define this whole issue in terms of dollars, because it really comes down to that. You can't afford to pay these guys that kind of salary when your stadium is half empty, and I think football players don't get the best salaries anyway relative to what the owners make, as opposed to the NBA where there's like giant contracts that are being doled out. And I think from an excitement perspective, the NBA is definitely going to overtake the NFL this year. I mean, you've seen a lot of moves that have been made. So I think that there's going to be a lot more individuals that are still with the NBA. But if the NBA tries to go down this route, and you see Popovich, and you see Popovich trying to push it in that direction, and all of a sudden, people are like, oh, Trump doesn't want us to disrespect the flag. Let's disrespect the flag. Well, guess what? You have large populations of people who are very American, a lot of people who have voted for Trump. In fact, what was interesting is, LeBron said, okay, well, see, now everyone who even voted for Trump realizes that they made a mistake. I talked to Rex Ryan or whoever, maybe Robert Kraft, who was a Jew who supported.
Yeah, Robert Kraft turned on him over this weekend.
Yeah, and that could be temporary. I mean, these billionaires tend to work things out generally.
He's a jab.
Yeah, and so LeBron was using that as like a bludgeon, like, oh, well, people who voted for him, think it's a mistake. So I want people who did vote for him to recognize that it was a mistake. Someone asked him, well, there must be a lot of Cavaliers fans who voted for Trump. And, how do you reconcile the fact that they're Cavaliers fans and, that they made a mistake? And he made some type of bizarre analogy about how he doesn't like giving Skittles to his daughter at a certain time, because if you give her too many Skittles and she's running around and she won't go to sleep. And it was like, oh, so the Skittles is giving the United States Trump because, you didn't like the other side, so you just shoved Trump on him, and now Trump is turning out to be the bad problem. So it was just so bizarre, and it's like vacuous because it doesn't.
He's the Riddler from Batman now.
Yeah. Speaking of Trump, I think his supporters within the administration are few and far between. I think to this day, I think Stephen Miller is also Jewish, isn't he? Miller is a very common
Jewish name, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very common crypto Jewish name, meaning like they won't openly say they're Jewish, but they are Jewish.
Right.
I think there's a Miller family, that's a billionaire family in Indiana. I think there might be some spillover into the Illinois and the Chicagoland area. But he is still within the administration, and there's not too many other people. Gorka's out, Bannon is out, and they might be better being out because obviously within the government, there's certain military kind of style command and control, and chain of command, let's say. And I think the move to put General Kelly as the chief of staff was probably pretty stupid overall, long term, because he has taken out a lot of people that I would say Trump, would rely on. Most specifically, I would say, apparently, I don't, we're not privy to all the background stuff, but Trump has had a longtime bodyguard named Keith Schiller, who's basically been ahead of his side for decades now. And, when he goes to sleep, that's the last person he would see and everything else. And General Kelly, under the guise of chain command, took him out, apparently.
Doesn't mean he can't be bought.
Who, General Kelly?
No, I'm talking about his bodyguard.
Oh, his bodyguard couldn't be bought. Well, I don't know. I mean, decades of loyalty, and if he's not really money motivated, anything's
they
potentially possible. They might have found
something suspicious there. So, we don't have all the information.
Right,
so.
We don't have all the information. I mean, this is information that comes from
it's kind of like
Stone.
when Paulie set up Vito in The Godfather. He's a longtime driver, but all of a sudden he takes the night off, and then Vito gets whacked. It's the same thing. You can't be. And then eventually Tessio is like in The Godfather. Tessio eventually turns on him after Tessio came up with Vito and all this. So anybody can turn on anybody.
So you think that it's possible that Trump was the
I think that something was
catalyst of the
snuffed
move?
out.
Say that again?
I think something was snuffed out.
Mm.
Trump's not going to take any chances. And believe me, Trump is running this. If Trump disagrees with Kelly, Kelly's word is not going to go over Trump. Trump's going to make what happened happen. Trump's going to have his own bodyguards. So if Trump feels that something is suspicious about this guy and he gets removed, there's probably something to that.
Would they say that Trump didn't have a role to play in the fact that he was removed? That General Kelly, much like he removed Scaramucci right away.
If he's there with
who was
him
very
all
colorful
the
and I miss him.
time, Trump probably had some say in that. There's no way he didn't.
Well, he's lost a lot of his supporters, and so people are making a case that in this case or at this stage he's kind of destroying, because he's a builder, so he's kind of destroying the old edifice, and he's now going to rebuild at some point in the future.
I think they're
and
also
maybe
window
bring
dressing.
back even more radicalized individuals like a Scaramucci type or a Bannon type back into the administration once the dust is clear and more individuals from the Senate and the midterm elections go through. Because you see with the Alabama election, I mean, despite the fact that Trump, quote unquote, supported the guy, what's his name, Luther Strange in Alabama, clearly Judge Moore won, and now he has to, I think, win in December again in order to come in. But if there's a massive purge of establishment Republicans and grassroots Republicans get in, Trump has a much better shot of getting his agenda across the finish line. Now, if they're drugging him, which is being alleged by Roger Stone and his allies as a result of, Schiller maybe not being there anymore, that process is totally different. I mean, we saw what they did with Latin American leaders over the last several years. A lot of them got cancer. A lot of them got purged in other ways. And now Venezuela, because I think Maduro is rather incompetent. And also the socialist structure doesn't facilitate a lot of quick maneuvers in terms of...
His idea of socialism is different than Chavez, because Chavez was more nationalistic in his approach.
Right.
Whereas he's pure.
And Chavez focused internationally, whereas Maduro can't even get to that point because he has so much chaos underneath him.
Maduro's a Trotskyite, essentially, but at the same time, he's getting smartened up to realize if for me to survive, I got to align myself with Putin. I got to align myself with China. And that's why he'll come out of this, I think, is because he's aligning himself with the right people. And Venezuela will always be relevant because they have oil. And to be honest with you, Venezuela and Iran, if they decided to just create their own APEC or OPEC, and Russia decided to just create its own UN with China and the whole axis of resistance, like, why not just have competition for the UN and all the UN functions? Create your own IMF. Have China be the head of the IMF, and then I think that you would have a tearing away, because then like the fringe countries that aren't really friendly with the UN would say, well, why do I have to stay with the UN? And then all of a sudden, chip. All of a sudden now Russia is the dominant power and not the United States and Israel, because they've taken this UN apparatus and just made it obsolete.
Yeah. And in many ways, I think Trump is a supporter of that agenda, whether he says directly so or not.
He can't say directly so.
Of course, yeah. And that's where a lot of people mess up, because they're like, well, why does he do this? Why does he say it this way? Why does he say it that way? And, no one's perfect. And, as someone, who's been in the media spotlight for decades now, I trust his instincts in terms of even when it comes to things like this, as opposed to other people who oppose him, because I feel like what he's accomplished has been tremendous. I mean, people think, oh, well, he's a billionaire and he's in the establishment class and he has so many billionaire supporters, and it's not really true. I think the people who tacitly support him recognize that the other side is just insane, and that's why you do have Jewish supporters of Trump, because as we spoke about offline, there has to be some, because they have to understand that the privileged lifestyle that we lead as a whole, and then Jews specifically, and Jewish billionaires, listeners, even more specifically in America, it's something that you can't really get anywhere else. You can't have that kind of freedom. You can't have that kind of influence and power and everything else. So do you really want a nuclear war that's going to, destroy your, consumer base of whatever products and services you're selling? Or would you rather, keep it going and maybe even become more profitable long term?
Well, here's the thing. I look at Trump a little bit differently than you do. He's a front for a covert base of people who realized the United States was in danger, was a little too comfortable with Israel. They're not anti-Israel. They want the existence of Israel. They just don't care about greater Israel. So that's what he is. He's a front for this movement. Now, within this movement, you're going to have people with the CIA, people with probably the FBI, people with, your NSA, Department of Justice. So within those people, he's going to have an advisor base because those are the people that brought him to power anyway. So if those are his advisors and they're doing this for self-preservation reasons, they don't really need a title. What Trump has actually done is he's used the official advisor titles as window dressing. And he's created blame sponges. Why not have your Secretary of the Treasury be a Goldman Sachs Jew? Because then Goldman Sachs gets blamed for everything. Mm-hmm. Then Jews get blamed for everything. Why not have the people in these advisor positions be Jews? And then Trump could say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic. I have Jews in all my advisory positions, and they're the ones that have been advising me to do all of this. So what, are they self-hating Jews? I don't get it.
And if Gary Cohn wasn't such a repugnant asshole, maybe I would put him at the head of the Fed.
Yeah. And so what we're doing is just window dressing. The only real relevant advisors that have official positions that are advisors are the generals, the military generals. Because I don't think Trump, even with his ego, thinks he could run the military. So he uses people like General Mattis and probably leans on them heavily. But in the economic sector and all of that, he's Donald Trump. He's run over 500 businesses. Do you not think that he's economically literate? Probably more economically literate than any president we've ever had. Mm-hmm. So to be perfectly honest, he knows what's going on. And why does he keep like Goldman Sachs figures? People will say Goldman Sachs and all of a sudden becomes a buzzword. Name me another company that's more ingrained in all aspects of economics and in the global economy. Whether stock trading or business trading or anything you have having to do with finance, they deal with it all. And they deal with it at a much greater degree than any company in the world. Now, we might roll our eyes at that, but Trump needs to actually have competent people in those positions that know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But he's going to get over the top because he's president of the United States. He can fire them if he wants. So they know that they got to tiptoe. They can't just do whatever they want. That's also why he's got to keep a lot of neocons at the Pentagon. Because he needs to have people that can competently run and people that experience. But he might eventually start cutting and chipping away and getting his grassroots people in there. But it's not going to happen overnight. Hopefully it'll happen before Pence gets in there, which I am really worried about. Because it could be very easily happen.
Yeah.
Just, all Congress really has to do is either find him, have charges, and then have their congressional opinion put him out for those charges in the case of impeachment, or find him incompetent as Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which, was all of this drugging rumors and Alzheimer's rumors are about. It's, we can make Trump incompetent. We can make him seem incompetent where he can't hold the office of president. All you need to have is a congressional opinion about that. Mm-hmm. So it's very easy to remove him and put Pence in. And that's the damn shame of it. And that's why I think it's smarter on the international front for Trump to use the United Nations instead of the United States government. Because if Trump gets out of there, it's going to be a lot harder to undo a lot of the things that will be done if Pence becomes president. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of countries say, oh, yeah, we were for this. Now what happened? And I think that when you're looking at one of the major reasons that Trump is so opposed by Jews is I think he really wants to contain Israel. Doesn't want to eliminate Israel, wants to contain Israel. And putting a base in the a United States base in Israel is going to be part of that, because it doesn't matter what policies you have, because you have policies, border, you have all, people have been trying this with Israel for years. If you don't have the means to enforce anything, Israel will just ignore it, and they will do whatever they want. So you have to have the guns there at the border saying, no, Israel, you're not going to do this. If you don't have that, no policy, no diplomacy, nothing will work with Israel.
Well, and you look at Syria as a microcosm of that concept, and that's kind of what Russia had, you know. Russia did come to some type of agreement where it's like, well, if you're going to attack Hezbollah, and, you know, that's between you and Hezbollah. So they were able to successfully attack envoys of Hezbollah, you know, weapon envoys, I guess that would be. And they were able to destroy that within Syria, you know, the Israelis. But many of their other objectives, Putin stood in the way. And basically at gunpoint, you know, they were threatened. Like, you know, we've got, what is it, S-400s at the border, and, you know, we're not really gonna let you run all your operations within the country with us being basically the sovereign power here on behalf of Syria. And what's interesting is now the border close to Israel and the Golan Heights and stuff, they're, you know, the Jews are shrieking about Iran building up a military presence, which they really haven't. But they were hoping to have, I think, a 50-mile border, and they try to work that out with Russia to say, hey.
Not even the United States recognizes Golan Heights as part of Israel.
Yeah, no one does. Yeah. And the Israelis were asking for a 50-mile buffer zone from the border to where, you know, Iran would not be able to breach. And I think they only gave them 5 miles. I think Russia said, no, I think 5 miles is good enough, which, you know, from an existential threat perspective, I mean, you know, you have to consider, they have to look at it and be like, okay, we have the one powerful, you know, global force, which is, you know, Shia paramilitary groups kind of sponsored by Iran, whether in Yemen or whether in Lebanon or even in Syria. I mean, you have to give them credit for being able to repel the Daesh and, you know, lunatic Wahhabi forces. You know, it makes sense for them to be kind of worried, because these people are not going away. They are hell-bent on, as we are generally, on dismantling the state of Israel and basically overturning it in many ways. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in a nihilistic, or, you know, in an annihilation. But, you know, we expect them, or I expect them, let's say, within the decade or within 15 years to leave with their tails between their legs, not just because of the military realities on the ground and their overextended nature, you know, trying to capture all those places for Eretz Israel, but also from a demographic perspective as well within, you know, Palestine. Because I've talked to Palestinians here in Chicago, and, you know, they say, oh yeah, well, you know, when our kids die, we generally tend to you know, we get upset, we're sad about it, but we usually have 10 to 15 kids for that reason, because we expect some of them to die, whether being martyred by Israel or actually going on martyrdom operations within Israel. And so, you know, we're going to keep doing that. And the Jews are very upset about us having so many children, because, you know, some Orthodox Jews do have children, but the modern Jews, the ones that are so-called secular and have more interest in financial things and things like that, and culture and transgenderism and all of that, they're not having kids, not at the same rate. And so it's up to the Orthodox to keep building up the community. And what's crazy is that the Orthodox are pretty crazy. I mean, you know, there's only so much Judaism a human brain can take before, you know, the insanity starts bleeding over into every aspect of their lives. And if you look at the Orthodox community, even within Israel, I mean, you know, as much as Jews are united within Israel and outside in the diaspora, they are the problem for other Jews. You know, they refuse a lot of times military service. They refuse to do anything but study the Torah and the Talmud, you know, and they're inert. And even on a political perspective, they're just genocidal. They're totally insane, and they don't recognize the political and military realities that they're facing. Because they have a traditional military. So when they go into Gaza every 2 or 3 years to quote unquote mow the lawn, what they're doing is just murdering civilians from the sky most of the time. I mean, in 14, they went back in, and I think a little bit into 15 too, and they went back in and they were just killing people, and even their tanks were getting destroyed. So they really couldn't even encroach much in Gaza. They had to bomb people from the sky. And so if you're talking about an open air prison with so many people, yeah, you're going to kill a lot of civilians, but all that's going to do is radicalize everyone else. And so you kill 2 or 3 kids from one family, watch what the next family learns from that and ends up having even more children. So ultimately, whether it's demographics or whether it's military, they're on their way out. And on a cultural and political level, their efforts in the United States are waning, because there's only so much of that cultural Marxism, identity politics, and everything else that people can take. I mean, it's gotten so bad with the microaggressions and everything else that people are openly rebelling, including white kids who have been taught to hate themselves, who grow up in leftist communities, go to schools and academia, and then they are taught all of these ridiculous concepts, and then they go browse on the internet, and all of a sudden a guy like Stefan Molyneux, who I think is very elementary when it comes to his perspectives and his ability to even articulate those perspectives, there's sometimes no rebuttal, because it is the truth that they're representing. So whenever you have that, you have that cognitive dissonance. Now you're like, okay, well, these people are suggesting this and that, and these people are actually using facts to defend their views. I'm starting to lean over towards these guys. Let me ask that question from the radicalized leftist groups, and then those groups are like, shun him, get him out of here, and silence him, and how dare you, and you're on their side now, and and it's just a pressure tactic, which it might work in an instance, but the human mind is such that it cannot be restrained and contained like that. So when you put those artificial impositions on people in terms of like what they can believe and what they can't believe, and what makes them a white supremacist. I mean, you'll turn a guy who is, thoroughly a self-hating white person into a white supremacist overnight just because they disagree on a certain pillar of belief when it comes to cultural Marxism, stuff like that. So I think it's only a matter of time before all of this stuff wears off, and it wears thin on the Gentiles around the world. And so that's where the minorities have a great role to play, is like intellectuals within that. They don't necessarily have to say, oh, I'm a Trump supporter and I'm a Republican and a conservative, but it's like, well, let's just expose the hypocrisy and the falsehood on this side, and let's come to our own conclusions on individual issues, whether I'm best represented by a conservative or a libertarian, or who, even maybe a independent so-called Democrat. It's better that I address those issues one by one and decide what I want to believe about it, rather than like, oh, we all are part of this group and now we all have to believe this. And if you look at the so-called communists or even the socialists that are at campuses and sprawling around all the major metropolitan areas, they're comprised of old people. Some of them Jews, some of them old white folks that have been brainwashed in the 60s and 70s, and they don't know how to appeal to the modern people. And there's a lot of young kids between 16 and 21 that are growing up, and I wouldn't say the conservative is the right word, but they're leaning towards the quote unquote right. And we're talking about minorities, we're talking about people who are growing up with Snapchat and all the social media and stuff, and they're just better at articulating their views and getting more people on their side because it's not as ridiculous. So I think the shifts that are coming, this is another role that he's playing, whereas like he may not be able to get everything on a legislative level get through Congress, because Congress is still totally controlled by their sponsors. But on a cultural level, and this is what they're really scared about, is on a cultural level, he's getting more and more people on his quote unquote side on certain issues, just because of his aggressive nature of opposing the alternative view, which is so demanding in terms of your conscience and your beliefs, and it's very invasive and intrusive. And so, I think on that level, we could commend him in more than almost any other level, because a lot of things that he wanted to do and he, claimed that he wanted to do, he's unable to get done. But these issues that he's trying to get done on a cultural level, that it's hard to quantify, because polls only discuss certain things. Like I just saw a poll that said a lot of Americans support banning players from kneeling during the national anthem. Whether or not that's a real thing, I mean, there is a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle that still feel like, hey, at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and at the end of the day, we have more freedom here than anywhere else. And what's interesting is that individuals within our communities and truth movement and stuff like that, Muslims, you know, they relish in this anti-American role. But for me, would I go anywhere else on earth? No. I mean, not just because I was born here, but because I don't think I would have the same freedom given my various identities. Number one, being a male, which is now starting to become a problem. It's problematic to be a male with a cisgender, heteronormative approach. Then on top of that, I'm an Ahmadi Muslim, where in most Muslim countries, you know, if they're educated about us, they feel like, you know, we're a corrosive force that are trying to destroy the national unity and destroy the edifice of Islam, which is totally not true. And as a result, they persecute us and murder us for just being different types of Muslims, just engaging in normal Muslim behavior, like, you know, the greeting of Assalamu alaikum, like, for example, in Pakistan and Indonesia and now Saudi Arabia and even Egypt. So from all of those parts of this, it's rather, you know, it's rather stupid for me to reject all the wonderful freedoms that I have here in support of some nation far away where, practically speaking, if I was to transplant myself there, I would not have the freedoms to do certain things. Like if I was to even, I think the stuff that I said about the Holocaust, which, by the way, I don't believe the official story of, I think maybe at the most 600,000 to 800,000 Jews may have perished, and largely due to disease. But I couldn't say that pretty much anywhere else in the world. Maybe in Iran I could say that, but then there may be other issues that, you know, in terms of being a religious minority, that may become problematic over there. So there's so many parts to this that I enjoy, the freedom of speech, especially, which I think this is the only country that has that kind of high level of freedom of speech. Canada doesn't have it. Germany doesn't have it. Certainly Austria doesn't have it. Spain doesn't have it. You know, Finland. I mean, you can just go down the list of European nations where there's all these freedoms, but like Sweden, for example. Sweden is supposedly one of the most free societies, but they've allowed the Jews to like toxify their discourse where everything is about transgenderism and so many different identity politics that even they're cannibalizing themselves. Like the transgenders are having issues with the normal female feminists and stuff like that. And that's what happens whenever you impose these types of ideologies on these countries and bring in an influx of, you know, unskilled labor or unskilled non-labor, you know, basically welfare class. I mean, these kinds of things are going to happen. So I wouldn't go anywhere else. I love being here. I love, you know, there's obviously many problems with, you know, the country, many things that the country has done, globally speaking, but I don't blame that on the country. I blame that on the Jews. Even the slave trade, when you look at it, you know, largely was a Jewish operation, and that's missed. And so, you know, the idea that, oh, these white people need to bow down to me when in their nation, like, come on, man, I just don't buy that, you know. It's rather sad and depressing and unfortunate that our Muslim nations have not built a solid country, you know, because tangibly speaking, I mean, we have to look at the world as it is, and empirically speaking, many countries fall short of the kind of liberties that we do have here still, despite all the Jewish attempts to kind of restrain them, whether it's guns or whether it's freedom of speech. I mean, they've really riled up the minorities with this hate speech stuff, and the minorities don't get it that, you know, okay, yeah, today you might silence a white supremacist from saying the word nigger or spick or Towerhead or Haji, but tomorrow the biggest factor and the reason why the Jews are orchestrating this and getting all the minorities to jump on board is because they know that we're coming to a critical mass of people who are awake about the Jewish question, and they do not want open discussions about this. They don't want to have to defend their views. They don't want to have to you know, have an intellectual argument about, you know, their role in countries as a corrosive fifth column. And it's about time that we've had those discussions. So what are they going to do? They're going to get all minorities riled up about nonsensical issues that really technically don't even affect them, especially not the bloviators in public, like the you know, the multi-million, almost billion-dollar athletes. They're not being affected by these things. So when you look at poverty and things like that, these are not things that the Democratic Party has solved. If anything, they've exacerbated, you know.
Yeah, and I think a lot of when you look at when you follow the NFL, and you within like 4 or 5 players a week are getting arrested, and for things that they are actually doing, you have to wonder if a lot of the police backlash is just because they're getting arrested and having to deal with police for things that they are doing. And they see them as the enemy, and it's like it's almost an extrapolation of, oh, well, this guy pulled me over for my DUI, and well, he's also shooting black guys, and it's a convenient extrapolation of that when they're actually committing crimes and getting pulled over and doing stuff in clubs and shooting guns and where they shouldn't be, and they extrapolate. Oh yeah, we're with this because we have to deal with the cops all the time too, but they're committing crimes. And I think that's why a lot of the players get behind this, is because they're always dealing with the cops because they're always bending the law. They're breaking the law.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they just don't have any respect for accuracy. So because of that, like the Michael Brown thing, I think the Michael Brown issue itself, the Ferguson issue, just moved a lot of white people into a more radicalized space, just because it was so fraudulent, and the hands up and don't shoot, and then it turned out to not be true. And it's like, well, that might be the case, and we might have made a mistake, but you shouldn't expect us to apologize for that because white people are evil.
What I loved about that case is they always framed his face like that, and they overlooked the fact that he's like 6'4", 300 pounds.
Yeah, which, I mean, that's not a crime to be a big person, but if you use it as a, But
they're making him seem like he was this little victim. But, I mean, if a guy's charging me, if I have a gun, maybe, okay, I can understand if you're a trained policeman, you're probably not supposed to shoot.
Right.
But if a guy that size is coming at me like a charging rhino, I'm probably going to pull the gun if I'm not a trained policeman. So
I thought they tased him first, and he was so big that he wasn't able to be immobilized with the taser. I don't know. I can't remember the details
but
on
sometimes
it. But
in the heat of the moment, I see a guy that size coming at me, I might feel the need to pull the trigger.
And the problem also was the corollary effects and ancillary effects of the fact that Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and other race pimps showed up.
Don't get between them and a camera.
Oh, yeah. And they showed up and riled up the people and held all these marches and stuff like that. And meanwhile, the water in Flint, nobody wants to address that, right? I mean, if you look at what happened with that, I mean, wow, it's been pretty insane, like all of the different things that have not been addressed, have not been dealt with, from one subject to another. It's so many things that they miss out on by focusing on an issue, especially an issue that they don't have the facts on. It just takes...
Yeah, Trump's not out in a black and white shooting black people. I'm sorry, it's just not happening. It's so to blame him for that happening, address the real issue. I would respect your argument if you would just address the issue. Like, why is this happening? Maybe we should bring up that they're going to Israel, learning anti-terrorism tactics, the ADL influence. Because what you really have is it's like a dogfighting ring. Actually, we compare this to a dogfighting ring. Is you're taking two dogs, you're drowning them, poking them with sticks, and then you're pulling them up and fight. And that's what they're doing with the police. That's what they're doing with minorities in the inner cities. And when you look at like a dogfighting ring, what you do is now you've created a place where emotions overwhelm everything. And what you have is no addressing of the cause and effect of what is actually going on. And that's why you have these impotent protests, but nothing will come out of them because there is no addressing of the cause. Nothing ever happens without addressing the cause of the problem. And of course, like always, the cause of the problem, Judaic interests are behind it. Is you turn over anything, there's Judaic interests behind it, and that's the problem. One thing that I've seen Mark Glenn say on Facebook recently is he compares it, like things like Israel, Zionism, they're the tumor, but Judaism is the cancer. And by removing the tumor, like let's say with our scenario of removing Israel, now are we addressing the cancer and not the tumor? Because what's going to happen is it's going to metastasize, it's going to reform, and that same tumor might just grow in that same spot.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about a cancer and excising a cancer like Judaism, which is an ideology, how would you go about doing that? all things being perfect.
Well, the easy thing to say is, oh, well, we could just take our Old Testament, we could extract those satanic verses within that Old Testament and address that as the problem, because it actually is the problem. And it is the problem that there is this supremacist cult who's using this front of this religion. It's not really a religion. It's a front. It's a snake oil that they're selling us to of the chosenism. And it's a supremacy. So the easy thing to say is, oh, well, we could expose that. But the problem is we don't have an information gap. That is not our primary problem. Because anything we could do with 9/11, with the USS Liberty, with the JFK assassination, with anything over the course of history, whether it be medical, curing things, we don't have an information gap. What we have is a courage gap, a courage to accept this information. Because I could put it there in the most perfectly placed, perfectly worded, beyond a reasonable doubt, and they could not accept it. So presenting information till we're blue in the face will only do so much until we address the courage problem that we have. It's a fear problem. It's a neurosis, because that's really what neurosis is. It's the avoidance of struggle, of something too painful to face. And that's what it is, because they can't face the fact that, yes, we have to exclude certain people and we have to exclude certain ideologies because they are evil in nature and they run counterintuitive to basic dignity, basic ethics, basic morality. It's common sense, it's evident, and yet at the same time they have to deny it. And they have to be said, oh, we have to be accepting of this ideology. But how many have ever read it? Because how many Christians read the Bible? I would love to see an accurate percentage of how many Christians read the Bible. Because I think that they would address it. I think they would address some of these issues. But one of the things that hurt them was Protestantism, because that made it adherence to the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is the problem. It's not the bloodline of Judaism. It's nothing to do with genetics. We are at war with an ideology and the people that adhere to that ideology. And even running deeper than that, this isn't the children of Israel versus the children not of Israel. This is the children of Iblis against the children of Adam. At its deepest level. Of Satan. Whatever you want to call him within your own belief system. It's good versus evil.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate paradigm. And from there, it's a chandelier that runs downward. Nationalism versus internationalism, Greater Syria versus Greater Israel. And runs down there. Now, down here, they get us riled up in irrelevant paradigms. And that's how they distract us from these paradigms up here, which are good and evil. And all you would have to do is simply read that Old Testament. When it says, for in the cities where the Lord gives you an inheritance, save nothing alive that breathes. Can you tell me that that is an ethical God? Can anybody with a straight face, with any straight morality? Because if you do, I really wonder about your ethics.
Well, here's another point that's is kind of related, is that the white nationalists and Christian identity people, they say that Islam and Judaism are the same thing. The Judaism spawned Islam. But if you look at the prophet and how he treated the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, how he treated slaves from wars, prisoners of war, let's say, how he treated the women and the elderly, how he treated nature, trees and such, in all of the defensive wars that were waged, you see a totally diametrical opposition to the tenets of Judaism within the Old Testament. Now, we don't, as Muslims, we believe that Prophet Moses and Prophet Abraham and everyone else received revelations from the divine, but this current or the manifestation of the Old Testament is not anything like what they were taught. And when it comes down to the Old Testament, the Talmud, and the Zohar, and then the Kabbalah and everything else, all of these things, the depravity is beyond most people's comprehension. So, for example, with this election, with the emails being exposed and WikiLeaks, a larger segment of our population became aware of the child rape networks, snuff films, the idea of scaring a child to death before you kill him and then drinking their blood. And so all of these things are happening, and it's been happening under our nose for decades all around the world. And this satanic pedophile ring, if you want to call it, I don't even know if pedophilia is the right word, because it's really child rape. Pedophilia almost sounds like it's like just an attraction, but it's beyond that. And they believe they're gaining power from that. Now, whether they all believe that or they just kind of go along, it's kind of irrelevant, because the children are being exploited and murdered and everything else. And what would strike a human being, a man's conscience, the most out of all the things in the world would be something like that, especially someone who has children and looks upon his children and shudders at the thought of someone else exploiting them sexually in and of itself, and then on top of that murdering them and drinking blood and doing all the crazy ritual stuff that they do. And there is a basis for this in Judaism. They have addressed this scripturally. So for me, answering the same question I just asked you, I would say, we don't have an information gap, but we don't attach these things. So like when you got the InfoWars crowd and this, blooming maybe white nationalist or American nationalism crowd, they know that the pedophilia is going on. They know the child rape is rampant and everything like that, but they refuse to associate that with Judaism, which is where it is most prominent.
But
not
that's
to
a courage
say
gap. That's
exactly
not an information gap.
Exactly.
The information's there.
Information is there, and they just haven't gotten to that point. Whereas, individuals like myself, we've been talking about this being the apex of the power for almost a decade, and probably a little bit more now, because the mechanism they use is that they get individuals in compromised situations. Sometimes these individuals are not child rapists. They just happen to pass out because they were drugged, and then you throw a kid in the bed with them and take the clothes off the kid, and you got cameras set up everywhere in these weird parties that these guys have. I mean, if you look at Eyes Wide Shut, you'll see a kind of a small view of what may transpire. Now that individual, whether or not he's guilty, is going to have to do what he's told. Otherwise,
it's like in The Godfather Part 2, when that Nevada senator was in the bed with the hooker, got slashed up, and he had nothing to do. He wakes up, and all of a sudden now Michael Corleone gets his way and gets his gaming license because.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a high level pressure tactic that operates largely behind the scenes, and they just use this footage as okay, we've got this footage now, so you just better listen. And guess what? It's the carrot and the stick routine again, because it's not just so much like the pain of what may be exposed, and then me having to defend myself against 6 giant Jew media companies, but it's also the the effect of how do I could also gain millions of dollars and ease, and my kids don't have to worry and everything else if I just follow along. And who am I to stand up alone? And that's why I give respect to Trump, because I feel like in many ways him standing up, I mean, who else would we have even put in that position? Who else is intelligent enough to use his words in such a dynamic way, where one minute he's saying one thing, the next minute he's saying something else, and he's confusing everybody. I mean, there's so many Jews that are in support of him because they don't recognize the certain things that he's doing that's going to eliminate their escape route into Israel. Because a lot of times, I mean, like we've discussed, Jews, the reason why they believe in Israel, the reason why they want that there is just a safety mechanism. It's just, in case I get caught up in Gentile nations with, all the crimes that I'm committing, behind the scenes, I'm going to have a place I can go and escape extradition. And, that's why Meyer Lansky went there, after he was done exploiting the United States to the mob. So that's something that, never gets really addressed. But if you go down to the deep roots of it, attaching this, awakening about child rape and snuff films and all of that with Judaism, that is the epicenter of this. That's not to say that priests don't do the same thing or imams don't do the same thing. We know that they do. The issue is that there's no doctrinal scriptural basis for it. Whereas with Judaism, not only is there a scriptural basis for it, but it is recommended. It is something that is seen as a meritorious act.
It's a practice of their religion.
Right. And that's why in Europe, when they talk about the pogroms and stuff like that, well, maybe if you didn't kill Hugh of Lincoln and drink his blood, England wouldn't have expelled Jews. I think that was in the 1600s. I forget exactly when that was.
1290 was when they expelled the Jews.
They've done it multiple times, though.
Right.
I don't know if Hugh of Lincoln was 1290 or in the 16th. I can't remember, but
there was also coin clipping. There was child sacrifice. There were many reasons why they did it in 1290. So.
Yeah,
coin clipping was the main one.
Yeah, and they've done it throughout the world. They even did child sacrifice like that in Syria, and they knew it was Jews because of the way they did it. I think there's some doctrinal basis for the fact that they have to do it in public. They have to do it openly. They have to do it, like, for example, they can't dispose of the body. They can't dismember the body and, like, chop it up and just eat the body. They, like, have to put it out there. They have to, like, make it be seen. And they have certain holes in the body where they extract the blood. And they've been doing this for, thousands of years. And in fact, I may have mentioned this on a podcast before, but it's worthy of research. Vicky Poland was a name of a woman. I think she used a pseudonym. Vicky Poland, you can look this up, was on Oprah in the 80s, I believe. It could have been the 90s, but I think it was the 80s. And she was talking openly about Jewish-style sacrifice, and I'm very close to Skokie.
Right here in Chicago.
Not even just right here, like right here, you know what I mean, where we're actually at, really close to Skokie, where a lot of large Orthodox community exists.
Right.
And she says that this is not just my family. Like, they would have children within the Jews, the incestual relationships, and they would obviously the child's going to be totally mentally retarded if you just have a child with your daughter or something, your physical biological daughter, and they would use those children as sacrificial ritualistic for ritualistic purposes and ritual sacrifice. And she said that she was not the only family, and that they've kept track of the families that have been doing this throughout the centuries, which I think, it really got codified into the larger Jewish religion through the Sabbatians. I'm not saying they didn't do it before, but through the Sabbatai Zevi movement and the Jacob Frank movement, they started keeping track, and they took it to more depraved lengths and made it more organized. So she was talking about how they have a history. They have, many other families around the United States are doing it. They know who each other are. And so Oprah asked her, do all Jews do this? And she's like, well, no, not all Jews. I won't say that. And then she created an organization for victims. Because obviously you're not going to have a pretty little white Gentile baby to sacrifice every single time, maybe on Passover, maybe on Purim, but you're not always going to have ready access to being able to just snag a little white baby. So, they've killed their own. And I mentioned that in a rhyme that's coming up on our record with Jonathan, hopefully once he gets his issues resolved as it relates to his ability to speak. But I mentioned that in a song about how if they're going to rape their own, why wouldn't they rape yours? If they're willing to murder their own kids, they're willing to rape them. I mean, why wouldn't they do that to yours? And they're within the Jewish communities and certain Orthodox communities, it's very, very well known that the rabbis are doing this. I mean, they do it right when the baby is born, when they circumcise the baby and they suck its blood with their mouths and give a baby herpes in many instances because of all their other weird sexual escapades. If they're going to do it right up front, they're going to do it later. And a lot of these parents have been abused as children, and they just accept it as something that's supposed to happen. And in fact, I think there was a book about the Shanda or Operation Shanda. I forgot exactly what, but there's been books written by Jews that are like, I don't know why we do this. I don't know why we're having this epidemic of child rapists within the community, and we refuse to expose them. And I understand that you don't want the Gentiles to be upset with Jews, but
just read the book of Leviticus. You will learn about how this perversion starts and how it's extrapolated. I mean, we talk about the Talmud, but the Talmud is essentially an extrapolation and a exegesis of that. So it's just, but it's rooted in Leviticus. But Leviticus itself is a front for Satanism. They're the children of Iblis. They're not the children of Israel. And if we get that in our minds, that this is a good and evil thing, that these scriptures are counterintuitive to basic goodness, basic ethics, basic empathy, basic morality, then we could see that. How could we look at the Old Testament and say that this Yahweh character, one of the most vicious people in all of fictional characters, is a good God? It cannot be, that case cannot be made. And if it can be made, there's something wrong with you who are saying that.
Well, the only way that that case can be made is if Jews are a superior or the only human race, and all the rest of us are really cattle, and they have a manifest destiny to control us the way human beings control animals. Then you can make the case that, well, they're not human beings, and, they need to be.
But there's a way that the Jews olay this a little bit, is they become atheist Jews or secular Jews. Then they don't have to defend this, but they still retain the chosenism.
Not only that, they still do bar mitzvahs.
Right. Or
Ron Jeremy had a Jewish wedding, didn't he?
Yeah. But or like the Kabbalah, or you create this this whole story about how God emptied himself out in the creation of the universe, and basically saying God is dead. And then we, as the chosen people, all of a sudden with this Jacob's ladder theory, oh wow, Jacob's ladder, Jacob, Israel, children of Israel, they ascend through that, and they're the chosen people still with that narrative. Yeah, God's dead. Then we don't have to defend the God, we don't have to defend the scriptures, but we can still retain the chosenism. It's an olay, because they don't really care what the Gentiles think.
As long as they have tribal cohesion, I don't think it matters why.
I think their extra Torah books that they write are not even written for the Jews themselves. They're written to confuse the speech of the Gentiles. Because they said, oh, well, the Zohar said this, the Talmud said this, the Kabbalah said this. I think those are written for the Gentiles and not the Jews, because the Jews know what they believe.
Judaism Discovered is probably a great book for anyone who really wants to get into the depth of this, because it was written by Michael Hoffman a few years ago. I've barely skimmed it, because it's a massive book. I think it's well over 1,000, maybe 1,100 pages, but it goes into incredible detail in terms of the books and the scriptural basis for all the evils that we see manifest. Because it's one thing to say, oh well, there's a Jew in this position or a Jew in that position, but there's somebody who will be like, oh well, what about Bush, or what about Trump, or what about this, what about that, to try to conflate the issues and to try to kind of hide.
That's why they have their Trojan wasps.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why they hide behind them, and that's why they've got them blackmailed. But it's, if you bring up the scriptural basis for it, you can't go in the Tao Te Ching or the Quran or the, so many other scriptures where these things are openly endorsed. It's only in Judaism and the Judaic books that you'll see this over and over and over and over again. I mean, what is up with the fascination of toddler, sex practices? What is that? But then now you see it manifest where the young kids in schools are like being taught at a very young age. And you might not really be a boy if you really think about it. I mean, do you really feel like a boy? And besides, it's kind of evil for you to call yourself a boy. Why don't you just be like, gender neutral? And so now you have 3 or 4-year-old kids like, I feel like a girl. And now, and there may be some chemical imbalance effects that, correlate with some of this stuff. But even that, from an environmental basis and the kind of stuff that they put in the water and the environmental estrogens and things like that, like they knew what bisphenol A had in the 80s when they, put plastic bottles in that, and they knew that the infant, the formula milk was terrible for kids, and it created an estrogenic effect in children, and made, girls go through puberty much younger, which sexualizes them. Because now, the adult pedophiles and creeps and perverts see them as sexual objects even more so. So all of these things have their root in Judaism, and it's not only accepted, it's like promoted. Now, some of the Orthodox have been able to, screen their kids from this, and some of the regular secular Jews are acting like normal white people who are like, oh my God, what's going on? But nobody will address the fact that the roots of all of this stuff is in Judaism. Mm-hmm. And once you do that, you take away the facade. And now, all that righteous nationalism or indignation comes to bear on the ugly face of Judaism, as opposed to like, oh, well, so-and-so is your problem, so-and-so is your problem, and stuff like that. Like, for example, I mean, we talked about Dylan Roof and him killing a bunch of black churchgoers. But then the other day, there was a black, was he Somalian immigrant, who just went off on some liberal church, and a lot of regular white folks got murdered. But
this is why the white nationalists don't address the issue, because they think it's a lineage thing. They think it's so the Jews can't help themselves because of their genes.
Yeah, that's not the case.
And they don't not.
It's an ideological brainwashing from a young age, where if you're better than everyone else, and look at these ugly goyim, and look at what they do, and look at what we do, and look at our diet, and look at our rules, and look at them, and
But why can't these Protestant? Why can't these Christian identity? Because they would have to address the Old Testament, which they adhere to.
Yeah.
So that becomes the problem, and probably why we might have to isolate the Protestant along with the Jew.
And also the other part of it is that they want to always address the tentacle rather than the octopus itself. So it's much easier to say, oh, well, Muslims are your problem, or the Mexicans are your problem. And not to say that these people haven't played a role in the larger Jewish scheme of destabilization and disunity and sedition and everything else in countries, but they're being orchestrated by a larger Jewish power broker, which is usually B'nai B'rith in every country, because B'nai B'rith is the 33-degree Freemasonic arm of the Jews that they use to dismantle society from the ground up. So let's continue to go on. I think that you have a few other subjects. Is there anything else that you'd like to address that's kind of related? But
no, I want to just address that one of the things we have to do is we need to stop getting so distracted on other issues and getting out of the paradigm thing. So what I think we need to do is we need to focus on the few things that will hit the bullseye, because within 5 subjects, you can understand how this world works. If you studied the 5 dancing Israelis on 9/11 and then got into what caused that, and then all of a sudden the spy rings that were in the United States at that time, and how 140 spies were caught that year, and not only that, but not only adding that to the 5 dancing Israelis in the urban moving van,
moving systems
van. But you can understand how the cover-up happened and who let them go to Israel. And then you learning that mechanism. So if we learn to focus on that, stop getting distracted with no planes and thermite and the physics and trying to act like we're physics majors and we're not. If we got to that, because that's the relevant point. The most relevant point of any conspiracy is the conspiracy. So when you get to that point, tie that, Jonathan Pollard. Okay, another Jewish spy or Israeli spy. And, wasn't Hillary Clinton doing the same exact thing that Jonathan Pollard was essentially? I mean, what was she doing with those state secrets?
Mm-hmm.
She was giving them to Israel. I mean, how can we not see that? So,
and also, when you look at the Mossad doing 9/11, then you realize the Mossad has been doing a lot of things, and
right.
Mossad, Shin Bet, and
World Trade Center
intelligence apparatus, the first World Trade Center bombing in '93, even as far as Argentina, Yemen. There's been so many different false flags throughout the globe. The train bombings in Spain, and I think it was 2004.
And this recurring theme of where basically the Mossad dresses up like Arabs and does the false flag.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is
Arab
what ISIS
Muslims.
is, just held over a long period of time.
Yeah, ISIS is basically radical Jewish, I wouldn't even say military forces, just a bunch of cutthroats who are,
right.
their ideology is Judaism. It's very apparent.
I think it was The Ugly Truth that ran a video and compared it to that scene in Blazing Saddles when they're gonna attack Rockridge, and they have this line of just all the thugs and every thug imaginable, and that's essentially what ISIS is. It's you just you empty out a Saudi prison and put a bunch of Jews there to run it. That's essentially how you could create something like ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And then Saudi Arabia gets rid of all their prisoners.
Well, and they just caught another. I mean, I think it's been at least 5 publicly known Mossad agents that have been generals of ISIS. Mm-hmm. One was just caught in Libya. I know that there's been some that have been caught in Iraq. There's some, I think, that were caught in Syria. And so this is a phenomenon that you can't deny. And it's very rare that you hear Muslims talk about it. I've talked to Muslims, and the other day I was on Facebook, and I was banned on Facebook multiple times this year, so I haven't really been on much this year. But I was on Facebook, and one of the members of my community, very well educated, said something like, "Oh, God bless John McCain because he opposed the Graham Cassidy healthcare bill, and that was going to make so many people uninsured." And I had the same type of reaction. I shuddered and got viscerally angry, and I said, well, that demon is probably on his way to hell, but time will tell. And he was like, "Oh my God, that's so extreme, what do you mean?" And I was like, well, this guy is the American sponsor liaison of ISIS, so I don't think you can get much closer to Satan than ISIS. I mean, and much closer to Satan than the American sponsor
Maybe
liaison.
his father who covered up the USS Liberty, but
yeah. I think his rap sheet goes much further than his father's ever.
Oh, totally.
Did, but anyway, my point was that, and so then he was like, "Well, I think that you're mistaking the fact that he supported the Syrian rebels early on with the fact that he's the American sponsor of ISIS." And I said, I just put LOL, and I put a link to Google Images, just typed in John McCain and ISIS, and you see the images of him being there with Baghdadi. So if Baghdadi is the guy and he's the
but here's the thing: Israel doesn't care about that because they don't care if John McCain gets hung. I mean, he's a nice little whore for them, but at the same time,
they're gonna always have more. They have more already as it is, and in fact, one of the things that keeps these people in line is like, if I don't cuck out, if I don't acquiesce, if I don't agree, if I don't do what they're asking me to do and be more and more aggressive, like you see with Graham and Mitch McConnell and obviously John McCain and people like that, they grovel. They like try to beat each other at who is going to bow down to the Jews more and Jewish interests more. And so as an individual, even if your conscience did strike you, you'd be like, well, if I don't do this, someone else will. Someone else will do anything, and so why not me? Because they've already put me in this position of power. If I don't acquiesce, if I don't do what they asking me to do, then they'll just find someone else who will. And I think that's another thing that keeps people in line. Because John McCain, I mean, he's 90 years old. He's probably very delusional, senile at this point. He's got brain cancer.
Well,
brain tumor.
one of the things you can look at right away is the same people that brought John McCain to power are the same people that actually brought Sarah Palin to power. And I think she's been just rejected because I don't think she's a puppet of them anymore. I think at one time she totally was, but I think she just rejected them. I think they
probably don't have her on video drinking Goy baby blood.
Well, yeah, I also think that when her son had the post-traumatic stress syndrome and had that, I guess it was a shooting or something, it kind of woke her up. Yeah. It's like, this is what's happening to our American soldiers, and those mommy instincts kick in, and it's like, I need to stop this. Almost within a week, that's when she came out and supported Trump. In that same exact week. Mm-hmm. So I think there was something between those two things. And I don't think she's part of that machine anymore. I think the only time you ever see her is something to support Trump. So I think Trump's protecting her.
Where do you see the whole... we're at like 2 hours roughly, so we're going to slowly try to wrap it up. But where do you see the Russian-U.S. relations going? Like Morgan Freeman recently came out and said that we're at war with Russia. A lot of celebrities are obviously endorsing this whole, Trump is a Russian Putin puppet. But where do you see the actual relations going? Because, I mean, I think from what we've seen, Russia has shown a lot of restraint, considering that as much as Trump would like to have normalized relations with them, he doesn't. He's trapped in so many ways that he really can't affect as much. Like, for example, a few months back, was it a couple months back, they had a sanction bill that mentioned Russia by name, and he signed it because, vetoing it would have just showed how ineffectual his power is and how he didn't have any power. And so he made a presidential statement about, well, there's a lot of problems with this, but I'm just signing this for the sake of national unity. So Putin, and Russia itself has kind of given him a little bit of leeway, where I don't think they would have given that to Obama. And so where do you see that going in the next few years if he lasts this, first term?
First of all, when you talk about Russian sanctions with the United States, it's something that actually hurts the United States more than it hurts Russia. Putin's not really caring about that, because you know what Putin can actually do now? It's like, oh well, I have sanctions against the United States. We're at war with the United States, and you know what? The whole world's applauding that, because most of the world, you got a globe full of enemies here, and Putin is very good at taking the enemy of your enemy as your friend and making cash out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And oh yeah, you're anti-American. Oh, you're yeah, me too. Let's work together. That's why he's the most popular guy in the Middle East.
He, arguably on a tangible level, if you want to say one person has the most power on the political level, he might have the most power in the whole world right now.
He does, and he also has the force to back it up.
Yeah.
And so he's actually making money. It's almost like a force multiplier for him to have those sanctions, because he can make money off of that. He can. And a funny thing happened on the way to Israel, trying to get all the pipelines and trying to get an oil monopoly. This inconvenient guy named Vladimir Putin showed up, and because now they can't destabilize Syria, they can't get that Haifa pipeline. They can't get those oil pipelines to run, because Israel is in the only place in the Middle East that has no oil. So now all of a sudden, oh wow, let's think about the electric car again. Let's make oil irrelevant. And oh, maybe that has something to do with why we want to make Venezuela less powerful, or try to control Venezuela. We can't seem to control Venezuela, but what maybe we should just have the electric car. And people will buy it up, because people think for some reason that that's way more ethical than a gas-powered car, when it really isn't, because you still have to strip mine cobalt for the electric car. I mean, it's not really that more ethical.
Isn't Iran working on a water vehicle? Water power, hydrogen powered vehicle?
Right, but what's that going to run on? Think of the stuff in it's going to have to run on something. And where's that coming from? Is that gonna pollute the water? So we have to think all of this out. The only thing really wrong with oil, besides leaking, which I think is a byproduct of using cheap Chinese steel, the only real problem is the hoarding of the oil by a few hands.
Mm-hmm. Mainly and then artificially setting prices and using it as a bludgeon with the petrodollar schemes, etc.
Yeah, but if you drill down anywhere on the earth, you'll find oil. It's like diamonds. It's not rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of getting down there. The reason why Henry Ford was able to mass produce the automobile was it coincided with, at that same exact time, the double cone oil drill, which could cut through rock, which 6 Harvard students created, and then Howard Hughes Sr. stole the patent for, and basically became the second richest man in the world because of that. So that's the only reason why all of a sudden now we're driving cars. And then Henry Ford, who basically learned how to mass produce them because he was skilled in watchmaking and used the same exact mechanism for a conveyor belt as a watch, all of a sudden now we have all these cars. And that's how that whole process unraveled. And we probably could have had it a lot sooner. It's just a matter of being able to cut through the oil and having extrapolating it from the ground. And diamonds, diamonds are excessive in areas where there's lots of volcanoes, because they can just easily rise to the surface. But if you go down far enough, you can get diamonds anywhere. So it's a matter of people just wanting to have the means to go and get them. And so oil, Henry Ford originally wanted his cars to run on hemp ethanol. And that was a byproduct of prohibition, because it's an alcohol. So they got that banned, and it got banned almost to the exact day that women started getting the right to vote, because they exploited the emotion of women being beaten by their husbands through alcohol, and women getting the right to vote overturned that, because prohibition wouldn't have passed without the women's vote. So almost to the day, that's why Rockefellers and people like that were getting behind, oil people were getting behind the women's suffrage movement, because they knew they could work that into their favor. And this is how the political game is run. To something you wouldn't even think of. Why would an oil person care about women's suffrage, except for the fact that you could exploit it? So something over here might have something to do with over here, but people aren't putting those two together. And it's the same with Trump. Something with North Korea might not even be something you're even thinking about, or any of his advisors. It might be something you just like. I really think that the reason he kept Steve Bannon at the White House for so long, he always intended to fire him, or whatever, resign, fire, whatever. Only because he was going to keep him there and basically learn how to write about certain real truth issues, maybe like USS Liberty, 9/11, things like that, and write for Breitbart. And get that base behind it, because you have to incrementally do that. You can't just come out and write, okay, 5 dancing Israelis did 9/11, blah, 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 and USS Liberty. You have to work towards that. It's kind of like what you said about giving a baby a steak. You have to incrementally work to that point. So subtly, using the Breitbart base, well, we might frown about like, oh, well, they're started in Israel and blah, blah, blah. It was founded by a Jew. But yeah, a lot of people that are angry read Breitbart. A lot of people that make influence.
Well, they're not going to get
Trump reads Breitbart.
They're not going to get those types of ideas many other places. I mean, I read Breitbart. I don't necessarily read every article. I just kind of skim the headlines and stuff.
Well, you should read your enemies' works anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's how you learn about them.
Another thing that we're noticing is that the phenomenon of like Jews supporting Trump and like Cernovich is coming out in full force with his Judaism now. And Mike Cernovich, a few months back or maybe even a year back, he was just trying to be like, oh, I'm that guy who kind of, popularized myself with my books about, achievement and things like that and accomplishing things. And then through supporting Trump and writing a book about Trump, etc., he gained national notoriety. And now supposedly he has, I believe it, I'm sure he has some contacts within the White House and things like that. But he's now coming out in full Jewish bloom. He's talking about how one of the reasons why he's so accomplished is because he's a Jew, because Jews are accomplished and they all accomplish massive goals. And he's now a friend of Pamela Geller's, who, we already know who she is and what she's about. And, their left is creating these things where these individuals are so-called are allies, where they're not. But the issue is that sometimes the left is silencing them through Google, for example, on YouTube, which I wouldn't be surprised if they do that to us once we get some heavy subscribers. But at some point they always have been silencing the left, and one of the things that they've been doing is, the left has been silencing the right. And like, for example, minority Trump supporters, like I think they're called
Antifa.
No, the two black women that are always on InfoWars. I forgot their name.
Oh, yeah.
Something in Spice. Or
yeah.
I forgot their name. But there's two black women. They had their YouTube monetization taken off, where they get the money for commercials and stuff like that. Another black girl who's, I don't know if she's a Trump supporter, but she's definitely on the right now. She was actually viciously verbally assaulted with racist stuff when she was younger, and then she saw Al Sharpton and everybody else come to her rescue, and she was like, wait, what the hell? I didn't want to be a victim. And so that started her awakening process, and now she exposes Black Lives Matter and other groups, so now she's losing her viewership. They're doing all types of things to the algorithms to prevent people from seeing this stuff. And so apparently Pamela Geller has also been her platform has been reduced to a degree because of this. And it's crazy because they ran the whole thing. I think Mark Glenn talks about this probably most eloquently, but it's something so funny because several years ago, they were the architects of Islamophobia, right? They were the architects. I remember 2008, I was traveling to visit my family on Thanksgiving, or the day before Thanksgiving. And I was driving home and I saw a car in front of me that had a Jihad Watch sticker, which was at the time run by Daniel Pipes, Jihad Watch. And he works with Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller. And Robert Spencer, I believe, is a crypto Jew. He fronts as a Catholic, which many crypto Jews do front. He looks Khazar to me. But anyway, I was like, okay, we're in Kentucky, and this sad regular white guy, has this Jihad Watch sticker because he thinks the Muslims hate him. So I was trying to take a picture of the sticker because it's on your car. I mean, it's in public view. I was just trying to take a picture. Back then, the cameras on the phone weren't so great, so I had to bring out my actual video camera while I was driving to take a picture. And they saw the bearded guy taking a picture of their Jihad Watch sticker, and they freaked out and they called the FBI on me. And I had the FBI visit my family and then wanting to meet me, and eventually I met them face to face and told them that I love America, I love the freedoms that I have here, and I'm not planning any terrorism. And in fact, as a member of the Ahmadiyya community, we are victims of terrorism greater than regular white folks in America are. And I was simply going to write a blog post about it. So they were the ones who architected the whole Islamophobia, whatever you want to call it, anti-Muslim sentiment, right? Because they had to blame someone for 9/11 and then all the wars that subsequent and all the terrorist attacks afterwards. And then now they just do a massive U-turn where now the Jews are our friends and they're protecting us from Islamophobia. And you have Soros saying that, he's going to pay millions of dollars to people on Twitter who expose Islamophobia. And he has all these groups that are now Muslims and Jews together combined. And you're like, wow, what a massive transformation. And the general Muslims are so stupid in the West that they don't see this. And what's interesting? People can talk what they want about the Old Testament and the rabbinical exegesis on it and things like that. The Quran is very clear about the Jews. And that's what I try to remind Muslims, because they try to ignore those verses in the Quran. It's not that God said all Jews should be killed, but he definitely said in the book that the majority of Jews are treacherous. The majority. And he uses the word the Jews. He doesn't say, well, some of the xenophobic, Zionist, evil, child raping Jews. No, the Jews. And this is 1400 years ago. So you can imagine, and in our belief system, we believe the Messiah has come again. So from our perspective, they have rejected 3 prophets of God. And as you reject prophets of God, you go further and further into depravity. And, it's manifest that you are opposing the divine order, with the issues that plague your community, like, for example, child rape and drinking blood, etc. So it's so profound that they've been able to successfully squash the Muslim resistance to them, because in our entire Islamic history, they only overtook us one time. And that was in a very small place in Granada, and a poet saint came out, and his name was Abu Ishaq, and he wrote 80-something lines of poetry against them and riled up the people, and they went and hung all the Jewish conspirators that had tried to take over that land. And they only had a successful kind of run for like 50, 60 years. So this is our Islamic history. Not that we persecuted the Jews, not that we didn't give them freedom of religion, but we just didn't allow them to have power. It's very similar to what the Jews in Iran kind of have. And Iran is probably the closest model of a true Islamic, government that exists. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it definitely feels that, as close to perfect as we have now. And based on that, that's the exact same model, that we allowed them freedom. We allowed them certain, abilities and not restrict their movement and things like that. And also, people say that the dhimmi tax was so oppressive. The dhimmi tax was 2.5%. My state tax, in Illinois, the sales tax is 10.25 now. They're adding a soda tax, as we discussed earlier offline. And the income tax is well over 40% if you make a certain amount. So at the end of the day, half your money is taken by the government to fund Jew wars. And you're going to talk about the dhimmi, the protected class of Jews and Christians in Muslim societies, as an oppressive tax. It's 2.5%. And then they avoided military service as a result. So it's a lot of history that needs to be unearthed when it comes to this, because the Quran is very specific about certain things. They even say how the Jews manipulate language to get what they want to get done, and how they confuse people. And so, the Muslims, they have every right, based on their book, to be weary and suspicious of Jews, especially organized Jews. Because this is what the Quran was talking about 1400 years ago, and it's gotten worse. But yet now they're falling into the trap. And in the Quran, it specifically states in one place that you will find the Jews in the greatest enmity towards the believers, whereas you will find the Christians closest to the believers, meaning that. And then it says, and the reason why is because there's still amongst the Christians people who are humble and meek, And so just that verse alone, it's so profound, because right now the Muslims, at the behest of Jews who are running their organizations, are coming out against white Christians. They look at white Christians as the problem. And they may not say Christians every single time. They may say evangelical. They may just say white. But the people they're really against is the white Christians, because they're working for the Jews who have historically hated white Christianity, unless they can use it as a subversive tool and as a mechanism, like when you look at the evangelical communities and the Zionist Christians. So you have these Muslims like creating a phantom enemy, whereas their book tells them the enemy is their so-called friend now. And I think that once these things are fully understood, and once people go back to their roots and get back, like one of the things I see women, like Muslim women, for example, behaving very disgustingly online, in public, whatever the case is. And it's totally against a female's nature. It's totally against the natural order of things throughout history. But again, this is a toxified Judaic influence on the mind of the female, which is, it's malleable in that sense. It can be manipulated in that sense because there's so much emotion there, because it's made for a caretaking kind of role. It's a nurturing role. And so similarly, they've taken masculinity out of the male. And so that's why the male doesn't want to stand up to Jews. You would stand up by yourself against a giant global power? No. Why not just join the giant global power and blame white people for all your problems? And once these things start to really take hold, and people within these organizations, these individuals are going to realize. Now what's going to happen is there's going to be a group think and a kind of a collectivism where it's like, no, what are you talking about? That's not the case, and blah, blah, blah. But individuals within these organizations are going to start to realize that they're pursuing a Jewish agenda. They're just, by happenstance, they happen to be, Muslim and, being under these umbrellas of these groups. But over time, I think that is one thing that's going to, the Jewish arrogance of taking way more than they should and going beyond. Like, okay, is it not enough that you can do sex ed at 5 years old in school? Now you want to teach these 3-year-old kids that they're actually, boys are actually girls and girls are actually boys and all this stuff. I mean, they keep taking it further and further and further, and they're bringing a resistance, a natural resistance, a human resistance, of disparate peoples together against them. And it's only a matter of time when the money runs out, when the propaganda runs out, when the free speech that we still have in this country facilitates a permanent expose of what they have done in history and what they're doing now to manipulate. Because we're at a place where this is a great opportunity in history to excise Jews out of politics and culture, especially. I think those two things, and banking and academia and everything else comes from that. But first, you got to excise them out of culture. Culture right now, they're the architects of culture, and as a result, if we don't have a countercultural movement that's equally attractive or more attractive, that utilizes some of the things that they do but shows the opposite side of it, we're going to go to a point where we can't come back from it. And right now, the opportunity has never been better, in my opinion, because of the proliferation of information. Like you said, there's no information gap. It's really a courage gap. And the more individuals that show courage, more other individuals are like, wait a second, if he can do it, I can do it. It's nothing really difficult. And I've seen an influx of people in our so-called movement that I think have the right intention in mind, and they keep learning and developing more. And that's what we need to do. We can't be one individual trying to teach someone. I don't want to be a professor standing in front of a class. I would prefer having an open discussion, because there's so many other elements of that. The only group that I don't think should be in there are Jews, whether self-identifying or if you can identify them as that. And so if we have that kind of thing, even if it's not based on religious unity or even cultural unity or class unity or gender unity, we can still create a unity against the Jews the same way they look at us as like, we're all Gentiles. It doesn't matter if you're a transgender black woman or if you're a cisgender heteronormative white male. I mean, at the end of the day, they look at all of us as the same. If they can use us, they'll use us. If they can exploit us, they'll exploit us. And at the end of the day, they'll discard us when we've served our purpose. So why not recognize that they are the last several hundred years, they are the tip of the sword of our destruction, and expose them as such and oppose them as such.
Yes, and I think that one of the things is that freedom of speech can be a two-way street, because what happens is a lie can always outrun the truth. And the reason because is truth has certain burdens to it.
Proof.
You have to verify it. You have to
Yeah.
prove it. You have to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and you do a certain amount of due diligence. And I was watching this video where Denzel Washington was talking about how, journalism and how, what's the effect of having too much information.
Yeah.
The need to be first.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the need to be right. So when you try to be first all the time and you don't have the proof, it's so much easier to just put out lies, which they do to confuse.
And then you
our
don't even have to
speech.
retract them because of our ADD society. We just
Right.
move on to the next thing. So you don't even technically retract half of the lies
There's
you
a
put out.
quote by William Butler said that if a lie only believed for a second has done its job. I remember, the story about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, the black slave that he allegedly knocked up. And that story was put out by a newspaper reporter, but the next day retracted it. But the retraction was on the back page. The story was on the front page. And everybody remembers that story. Sally Hemings. Oh, well, Thomas Jefferson knocked up a slave with Sally Hemings. But the story was retracted. And history doesn't record it that way because people don't understand that the story was retracted. All they see is a snapshot of that particular cover.
Mm-hmm.
So a lie, believed only for a second, has done its job.
Yep.
And they do this. It's Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, where they're confusing our speech. And they're confusing us. And they confuse us with the Zohar, the Talmud, the Kabbalah, to mix with the Torah. And then we say, no, it's the Talmud. No, it's the Torah. No, it's the Kabbalah. No, it's the blah, 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 blah. It's Judaism. And then they confuse us with our identity groups. And then so they're always in a state of confusing our speech. And then it becomes the no-planers. And then the Sandy Hookers. And then before long, you have a balkanized people to where you have 4 or 5
Ideological
guys.
balkanization. Ideological balkanization.
Ideological balkanization. I mean, we essentially Oded Yin ourselves. Sykes-Picoed ourselves to where we're now a small fragment. It's me, you, Mark Glenn, and a few other people. That's our truth movement. Trevor Labonte, that's it.
Yeah.
Get past them and you get a lot of kooks and a lot of weirdos. And you get some part-time contributors, but that's about it. That's what it is. And I will say this much. The ugly truth to me is the solar system and all of this internet truth.
Yeah, and it's developed into that because the radicalization of different other elements. I mean, people don't know, I've mentioned this before, but Andrew England, who created the Daily Stormer many years ago, he had a website called Outlaw Journalism. Then he had something else before that too, but Outlaw Journalism was where he was at, and his whole thing was, we need to destroy civilization because civilization is the root of the problem, and technology is a problem, and we need to just live in the jungles like we used to and stuff like that. It was very bizarre. And at the time I was like, what are you talking about, man? This is obviously Jews. There's nothing else there is. I mean, you could blame anyone and anything, but why are you not talking about the Jews? Like,
but don't you think his ideology shapeshifts like a Jew? I'm not even saying he's Jew or Jew influenced.
He does, because people don't know this. He was a quote-unquote Muslim in 2005. I don't know if you can go back to the archives and look. He had Lion of Allah on his MySpace page. And I had a feeling, I even talked to him at the time, and I was like, hey, are you praying? Because if you're not praying, man, at the end of the day, like, all these identities, they're kind of, they fuse into each other. So, whatever you do, don't lose sight of that. Like, learn the Salat and actually follow through with it, because that's going to keep you from getting manipulated. And, with months or a year later, he was no longer quote unquote Muslim. Now he's got Outlaw Journalism. He was following a guy named Alan Watts, I believe it was, who would always write about and speak about these issues. And I had an open debate with him on his forum, and I just completely dismantled him by proving that this was a Jewish conspiracy. And then he disappeared and created another website, something called fascism or total fascism, I think it was. And then he came out with the Daily Stormer, and I saw all this Jew stuff, and I was like, wow, bravo. At least, you finally admitted that, you can't deny the overwhelming parasitic Jewish influence on everything. And he just became so radicalized, but he never stepped up to the plate when it came to like distinguishing between Jews and Muslims and Mexicans and black people. It was almost like everybody sucks, and maybe the Jews are a little worse than everybody else.
Yeah, and when people are reading that, they're not seeing the information on the Jews. They're just looking at nigger, spick, blah blah blah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been a great show. I appreciate you coming on. It's been a while, and I do apologize to the viewers, but life gets in the way a lot of times when we do stuff, and obviously there's very little support for individuals like myself because we're not very well known, and we just try to do what we can to keep things moving and pushing the envelope. If there's anything else you'd like to have us discuss on the show, and guests that you can suggest somewhere within the Chicago metropolitan area, you can reach me at just look up Khanverse, Khanverse online. You'll find me somewhere, and reach out to me, and I'll try to accommodate for those things the best that I can. Also, try to reach out to Brent. His name is Brent Schlueter. You'll see the name on the bottom, but reach out to him. Maybe try to convince him to write more, because clearly he's a esteemed intellect that we have, and he gets this from very many angles, and obviously has a wealth of information from history and many other sources. So we would like to get more information out there, and keep trucking on. There's a lot of good people in the world, and I think the numbers are growing, and it is a good versus evil battle. So ideologies and gender and race and class and all those things really have nothing to do with it. Ultimately, we have to work together. This is just the one planet that we're all given, and we're all children of God at the end of the day, regardless. So we have to work together to the best of our abilities to get the most amount of productive quality up, and get the most amount of information out, and try to help, to a degree, radicalize individuals who already have the information, to get them speaking and get them feeling like they have their own platform. Every individual deserves their own platform once they're educated on these subjects, because they have their own personal experiences they can draw on and different things like that. So if you have any closing remarks, Brent.
No, that's good. And just focus on what really matters. 9/11, USS Liberty, the U.S., us being attacked, the aid to Israel, and just focus on those.
Endless wars for Israel.
Yeah, and it's always the same thing. And then address the real cause of the problem. It's not even Israel. Go above that. It's JewDeism. Address the cancer and not the tumor, and we will be victorious. It'll take a while, but we will be victorious.
Inshallah, God willing. All right. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you soon.